Hello, and thank you for joining us today on the Happiness Quest. My name is Jess Dutel from the Center for Transformation at Plymouth State University.
And I'm Dr. Maria Sanders, a philosophy professor at Plymouth State University and CEO on Philosophy for Life. So today on the Happiness Quest TV show, we're going to talk about time and the connections between time and happiness. And interestingly, there's been a surge of research actually that is looking at the comparison of time with money. These seem to be the two most common resources that people turn towards that either can have a positive or a negative impact on our levels of happiness. So it's interesting when we think about, we've talked multiple times on the show about money and the impact that money has on happiness, and it does seem to go hand in hand because as the research shows, when we spend our money on experiences rather than things, like our clock,
Like my dusty clock right here.
that we end up have a greater return.
Yeah.
It raises our level of happiness more. So in effect, we're buying time. We're buying time with others, time even with ourselves, if it's quiet time, that calm and peaceful time.
So now it's time to talk about time.
So it's time to talk about time. And as I dive into a couple of what I found to be more interesting studies in this new direction, one of them actually surveyed individuals as they were going into coffee shops and cafes, and they had them in the survey unscramble words that were either tied to money or to time. And then they went into this cafe, and some of them were meeting friends, connecting with others. Others were doing work. They were on their phone. They were on their laptop. And on their way out of the cafe, then they resurveyed the same individuals. They didn't realize they were being watched while they were in the cafe until after the fact. But when they exited the cafe, they resurveyed them, and basically they were asking them about their feelings of happiness, you know, how happy they felt in that moment. And they started to see two things really, a direct correlation to how they spent their time in the cafe.
Either with friends or working.
If it was more connected to where they were visiting with friends, they reported higher levels of happiness when they exited the cafe. But there was also a correlation to the state of mind or the perspective that they entered the cafe with. So if they were unscrambling words about money, that tended to have a lower reporting of level of happiness when they exited the cafe than if they were unscrambling words about time.
Interesting.
So it seemed to shift just having our lens or our perspective on time seemed to shift how we thought about our feelings of happiness.
And maybe it suggests too our feelings about money, you know, maybe that causes some worries for people and the relationship that we have with money and time.
It's a rather complex relationship.
Yeah,
it
that's
really
fascinating.
Is. Well, and add to that, another fascinating feature is how we actually experience happiness. The feelings, when I say I feel happy, it changes as I age. So the further or older I get, so the further along my lifespan, to where we can view this as how much time I view myself as having remaining in my life, shifts the sorts of things that I focus on when it comes to happiness, as well as the feelings that imparts. So what the researchers were finding is typically with teenagers and those in their 20s, when they say they feel happy, what they're expressing is really a feeling of excitement. And likewise, the things that caused that feeling of excitement tended to be larger, what we would consider to be more singular events in our life. So bucket list type things, you know, getting married or winning a particular award. So things that you could mark that were milestones. As we age, however, and they were looking in particular 30s and 40s, they found that what caused the happiness, it could be a bucket list sort of thing. It could be something that really stood out or a milestone, but it no longer really needed to be.
It could also just be an ordinary day of contentment.
Ordinary, everyday event brought the same level of happiness as the bucket list item. So there was no difference, where we saw a difference with the teenagers and the 20-year-olds. Likewise, when someone in their 30s or 40s or 50s were saying, I feel happy, what it actually meant more often than not was a feeling of calmness or peacefulness. It wasn't an excitement feeling. In fact, as we tend to age, it seems that that excitement gets translated more to stress than happiness.
Yeah.
And so that's interesting too, that even my 20-year-old self compared to my 30-year-old self doesn't mean the same thing when I say I'm happy, and I'm no longer looking for the same things.
Right, that's interesting.
So yeah, it was fascinating as I started to dig into this variable of time. There were so many different ways to look at it, because time itself, it's really an illusion. When we think about it, it's not even real.
And it's a construct that is, in a sense, human-made, right? I mean, we invented time. Yeah.
And in numerous ways.
Right.
You think like the Greek calendars and then the Roman calendars, and now we have daylight savings time and things shifted. So we, in a way, we create this system of time and then force things to fit into it.
And we arrange our lives around our schedules and our calendars.
Yeah, time starts driving us.
Exactly. So this reminds me of an experience I had yesterday. I took the day off from work so that I could feel like I had more time with my family. Of course, it's April break for the kids.
Right.
So I wanted to have that time with them. And I'm going on a conference tomorrow, so I knew that later on in the week I was going to be pressed for time. So I took yesterday off. We decided to drive up the Kangamangas Highway. It was a gorgeous day.
Yeah, that's a beautiful drive.
It's so beautiful. Yeah. So we stopped a couple places, got out, looked around, did a little hike. Well, I have to say, it was a wonderful, wonderful day, but from the beginning of it, we were pressed for time. So we had to get back to Plymouth for my partner Brian to go coach track with PSU. So we knew we had to be back by 4:45. So that time was lingering over all of us, I think.
Isn't that interesting? And we keep one eye on the clock the whole time.
So even though I was having such a glorious day with my family, in the back of my mind, I kept having to check the clock to make sure that we left to have plenty of time to get back to our normal routine of things. So, and of course, anticipating this conversation today and thinking about how uncomfortable moments were, thinking this is wonderful in the moment, but we need to go. Come on, kids, back in the car.
You know, and
so we do that
a good
often, though.
Point when we think about the towns and social groups that tend to report the highest level of happiness globally, they tend to be communities that are not tied to time.
Right.
In other words, it's a more flexible kind of lens. It's not that they have no concept of time, but they don't feel driven by this pending time behind them. We tend to be at the other extreme in the United States.
Oh, absolutely.
We schedule everything.
We do.
And then reschedule within our schedule.
Many times, exactly. Many times in 1 hour increments, too. So in some ways, we lived fragmented lives, running from one meeting, one activity to the next in 1 hour increments. And what you just said reminds me of my sister-in-law's wedding. My sister-in-law married a man from Brazil, and in Brazil, time is a very different dynamic. And so the wedding, of course, on her end, it was very rigid. This is when it starts. This is when we have to be, you know, at the ceremony. The ceremony will then end promptly at this time so we can go to the reception. Well, for the side of the family from Brazil, they had a very different experience with time. And so it caused some anxiety for my sister-in-law.
There's a clash of time at that point.
Exactly. Two definitions of time, right? So it was very interesting culturally with how the schedule played out around time.
Well, and it was interesting when you said how we're scheduling things and then literally running from one to the next within an hour.
Yeah.
I did stumble upon a research study that's looking at the extent to which variety has a positive impact on happiness and at what point it begins to have a detrimental impact. And there's something, at least currently in the United States, that seems to be wrapped around that 1 hour time slot. So that if the time we have available is longer than an hour, it's better to have variety. So doing more than one thing or trying new things, having different options tends to result in higher levels of self-reported happiness. But when our time is restricted, and again, the magic amount seems to be 1 hour. When we have less than an hour, if we tend to try to tackle more than one or two things, so the more variety we have, it seems to be leaving people feeling as if they're not accomplishing anything. Or they're getting very stressed out because they're trying to accomplish everything within that time slot, and it's really too many items for the time allotted.
Yeah, it's overwhelming.
So in both cases, whether it's stress or whether it's this feeling of deflation, like I'm just not able to accomplish my goals that I've set, it ends up resulting in a lower level of happiness.
Interesting.
So although if it's longer than an hour, having the variety, that variety is the spice of life, seems to ring true. Yes. We tend to seem to be happier if we have different things at our access and if we're trying new and different things. But the key seems to be allowing enough time to actually fully engage in those new things.
And that's not surprising. I think we agree as two people who teach college courses that if your class is going over the hour mark, you really need to start switching it up, right?
Right. Well, and you definitely feel it just in how long we can sit in one place or engage in a particular activity.
And stay engaged.
Even an hour is a long time to just
20
sit.
minutes.
Right.
Right.
So again, that's why, as we both know, a lot of education is moving towards high impact and engaged learning. And we're realizing, in part, it's always been the case that the human being has a limited span of attention. But our current technologies are having an impact on that as well. And so that span of attention is really shrinking. And so it can be pretty short at times, which is something, quite honestly, we need to work on, or we'll lose the ability to dig deeply into critical issues. Because sometimes the problem requires, more than 10 or 15 minutes. So that's a challenge that we're finding nowadays. But time is always there. It's always there and in the backdrop, and you shared the day trip that you took with your family. We had kind of a spur-of-the-moment trip yesterday. As you're aware, my second oldest son just got accepted to University of New Hampshire, so I'm very proud.
Congratulations. And he's joining your older son.
He's joining my older son, and so we'll have 2 Wildcats come next year. And it was really kind of spur of the moment because Austin, who's a senior this year, has been really busy with activities at school, and he hasn't really had time to do the full-blown campus visits, to go and really spend a couple days just getting the sense of each of the colleges. It's been kind of rushed when we think about time. And so even though he has already committed, it's like I wanted him to have that experience of seeing the campus. And so his older brother, Kyle, said, hey, I'll give him a tour. I know the campus inside out, and they've been asking me to volunteer and give tours anyway. I'll give him a tour.
A personal tour.
So spur of the moment, after I finished teaching yesterday, we hopped in the car, headed over to Durham. And it was interesting because I was aware of time, but in a very different sense, because my pending time happened before we left, whereas yours sounded like it was happening after.
It was hanging over our heads.
Yeah, so you're watching it come down the pike. The only thing that I really had in mind is I didn't want to leave Durham so late that it was difficult the next morning, because again, time starts again. We're going back to work. But it was always really there. Like the trip was measured within time. Okay, it's going to take 1 hour and 20 minutes each way. How much time do we have for dinner? How much time do we have for this particular building versus going and seeing the labs? And so it's interesting as we put that perspective on time, the focus on it. It's really everywhere in how we're operating, at least in our current society in the United States.
Yeah, time is always in the background.
It's just always there.
Although we had the conversation on this program about leisure and how when you're truly finding your leisure and engaging in activity to that nature, you lose a track of time.
Yeah, it's almost a deliberate way of stepping outside of time, and a really valuable one. I mean, the benefits that come from that. There was a really interesting article that, and it was a Polish researcher, and I will probably butcher his name, It's like Warchutsky.
That sounds good to me.
Yeah, that's probably not accurate, but it's close. But he wrote this article on time, and again, he is a psychologist in the area of positive psychology. So he was writing it from the lens of looking at subjective well-being, so a type of happiness that focuses on life satisfaction or contentment, but within this context of time. And what I found interesting in his article is how he framed time. He was drawing out a lot of the current focus on the present, which again, we have multiple studies that show the value of living in the present, not dwelling on the past or constantly planning for the future, but being present in the moment of whatever we're doing at that time. And there's definitely undeniably benefits to that. But what this particular researcher was emphasizing was that the present, in his conception, was impossible to separate from the past or the future.
You just can't untangle it.
No, and so he was saying, when we think about this conception of time, my present moment, and even when I'm living in the present, it is a product of the past. So I am bringing all of that. I can try to mentally put some of it aside temporarily, but I'm not even really genuinely doing that because it's who I am. It's developed the person I've become.
And the future is dependent on where you are.
Right. And so it's, in a way, when we think about this time, the past, present, and future becomes a fiction of sorts. And so as soon as that lens shifts to where time just is, then time dissipates. Because we no longer can measure it if it just is.
It reminds me of Albert Einstein. He talked a lot about how time is an illusion, right? And we know that this concept of time is man-made. Another quote he has is, "Time and space are modes by which we think and not conditions in which we live." And I love that quote as well. So fascinating stuff.
That because again, it drives such a large portion of how we live. Even though we can pause and cognitively realize, well, we've made it all up. I mean, it's really a fiction of sorts.
So that brings to mind a TED Talk that I watched recently, which I love. It's by Laura Vanderkam. And she talks about how, we go around saying, oh, I don't have time for that. Oh, I don't have time for that. And I do that. I'm a culprit of that, saying I don't have time.
I think we all do that.
And then she reframes it and says, well, it's not necessarily always a matter of time, because if time is the illusion, right, maybe we could create some time. Perhaps it's more a matter of priority and what we're willing to make a priority in our lives. And she gives the example of, if you have something in your home, like an appliance that breaks, and I'm going to use a refrigerator because our refrigerator is it's on its last leg, so I'm a little nervous. Well, when and if, and I feel like now I need to knock on wood, our refrigerator finally goes, I promise we will make time to replace it. It doesn't feel like in this moment, in this day, or even tomorrow, the next day, that we will have time to do that. But if it does die, I promise we're going to make time. We need a refrigerator, right? So when something happens in our life, something shifts, and all of a sudden it requires our attention, our time, we make it, because then it becomes a priority.
Well, and it's an interesting balance that needs to be struck, because that's very true. Like when these emergencies surface, we find the time.
Of course.
We find it. But the reality is we can't do that consistently. In other words,
we can't sustain
that's not a sustainable model, because at that point now I just don't have a schedule. It's really just kind of chaotic. So it really comes back to a balance, again, of keeping on the radar, our lens, so to speak, the importance of making time, reprioritizing from time to time, shifting those priorities, and making time for things that tend to get lost, that may seem even somewhat ordinary in the moment, can actually become some of our happiest memories. I'm thinking of this particular, it was supposed to be a day trip. We were living in Texas at the time, and I had my two youngest children with me, Brandon and Jasmine. I don't remember where the rest of the family was on that particular day, but we had decided we were going to go to the beach down in Galveston. And it was about an hour, with traffic, an hour and a half from where we lived. So easy day trip. We got up early in the morning, did not plan on spending the night, so we really didn't bring anything except what we were going to use at the beach. And we just had this wonderful day. So we had planned for a few hours, probably about 6 hours, and then we were going to drive back. But we were having such a good time that I remember looking, as they were kind of playing in the waves a little bit, looking at them and saying, I don't really have a reason why I have to go back tonight. I had nothing going the next day. And for some reason, I want to say the rest of the family was out of town, because I remember there was no pending, like we had to be home.
Yeah.
And so very spur of the moment, I asked the two children, I was like, you want to just spend the night and we'll spend another day at Galveston? And of course, there was just this pause in time as they looked at me and they're like, can we do that? Yeah, can we do that? Because that wasn't something we typically did. And I paused and I was like, yeah, we can do that. I mean, we're going to have to probably make a run to a local store and get some supplies because we didn't plan on it. But sure. It turned into one of the best memories. They still bring it up. We fed seagulls, like off of the balcony. We just had this really great, right down to the T-shirt that Jasmine ended up buying so she had something to sleep in. Do you remember those cards where you would scratch them and they have scents? This was a shirt that was a peanut butter and jelly shirt that you scratched
scratch and sniff.
And and you could, the scents came out. Well, the scents, because it was a brand new shirt, came out very strongly
very potent.
In our small little room. And so, but that all became part of this memory. We had certain scents or smells that came with it, certain sights that got into the memories. And when we're thinking about time, we've talked about this before when it comes to our memories, we tend to embellish our memories. We can actually make them worse. We can make them better than what they were. And so there was one researcher that I stumbled upon when he was looking at time. He actually was asking the question, do people prefer to be happy, like in the moment, actually experience it, be happy,
or remember
being happy?
Yeah.
So do we actually, if we stopped and thought about it from a time perspective, prefer the activity itself and the experience, which by the way is fleeting, you get it in that moment and then it's gone, or is it really the memories where we're getting kind of our biggest return on how we feel when it comes to happiness?
That's fascinating.
And I have to admit, most of it's memories.
Of course.
And
think about how many photos we take. And now we're posting them on social media and we're going back and we're thinking, that was a wonderful time. But I've shared this in the past that, every summer we went on a family vacation growing up. And I look back and I have one memory of that vacation. My brother has a different memory of that vacation. They don't always jive. And so we take with us either what we remember as being wonderful or not so wonderful and embellish as we go.
And we create the memory.
Yeah,
it's not really the experience.
Yeah, that's interesting. When you're talking about your trip and the spur of the moment nature of it, it makes me think of, in my experience, the days where I decide, maybe I don't decide to park somewhere else because I have to, and I take a different walk to work or I go to a different place for lunch. When we make a decision that's out of our routine, it feels in some ways that we've captured more time. But when we get into our routines and the rut of it and we just go through the motions, it feels like time has a way of slipping away.
Well, and this is where the being present, we talked about leisure, but also a lot of the different techniques for meditation,
right,
where it grounds us in the present moment, can actually have the impact of increasing this perspective that I have more time than what I actually have.
Right.
In other words, time seems to expand when people are focused more in the present. And when we are creatures of habit most of the time. So when we get into these routines and we're just running from one activity to the next, that's when we can be left feeling like there's never enough time. So in a way, time shrinks, right?
Right. It reminds me also of the times that we've been discussing technology.
Yes.
And you can lose all kinds of time on social media, for sure.
And mindlessly, where again, I know they have some of the games out now where it's just tapping the screen. I'm having a hard time understanding that. I'm trying. I know I'm a dinosaur already when it comes to technology, but to just sit here and tap and tap and tap, and of course my kids will get into that. and it's just passing time. But I also look at it from the standpoint of when we feel connected, socially connected through social media sites, versus the reality of how connected we truly are. Because this feeling of connectiveness can actually be a disconnectedness. But it's shifting. Our entire frameworks are shifting with a lot of the current technologies.
And technology really was made to capture more time so that tasks took shorter amount of time.
And here, a very broad sense of technology. You think washing machines, think writing utensils.
Oh, exactly. But in terms of always being able to plug into the internet and having then the ability to do your work from wherever you are, sometimes it reduces leisure time that we have.
Yeah, there's something new emerging in this. I always refer to it as a technological revolution, because I really think we're in a time period right now that is definitely as impactful as our industrial revolution will be. It's shifting how we interact with each other. It's shifting how we even think about the human being, what it means to be human. We have robots now that are challenging those ideas. AI, artificial intelligence. As we move further into the Internet of Things, as you know, this is outside of happiness, one of my other main areas of scholarship is emerging technologies. So I'm fascinated not only by the humanoids and Robo Sapiens, but also smart home technologies and how
smart refrigerators.
The Internet of Things is going to interconnect everything. The refrigerator, as you think of it, is so different now that we have smart things. Your refrigerator can become a connection, a social connection, a political connection. Not only can it inform you when you're running low on certain food items, it can order that food now.
Yes.
They're working on eventually, there'll be very little human interaction where the food gets moved to a smart tabletop that prepares the food or gives you recipes on how to prepare it if you want to still be involved. But they're looking at having they're looking at having stovetops that'll literally prepare it all and order replacements for you that arrive at the door, maybe through your drones. So it's a whole different world when we think of all these emerging technologies. And the impact that has on time. It should be freeing up time, as you mentioned. It should give us all kinds of extra time. What we have found historically, not just computerized or digital technologies, but pretty much all technologies, tends to free time up in one area, but we kind of commit that time somewhere else. So take like the washing machine as an example. I mean, I can't even imagine the days of like my grandparents and great-grandparents where you're
with
hand washing. Right. You've got your little scrub board. I can't even imagine it. Or even when they moved to what was a real step up for them and it had the little hand wringer thing. I mean, we almost mindlessly toss it in. And the technologies now are developing our washing machines and dryers to where it'll eventually be one unit that washes it, it moves it to the dryer, and then moves it to a folder. They've got the electronic folders now.
That's what I need.
Yeah.
The folding
So
machine.
will that then save time where we don't have to fold clothes? Well, no.
And how
we're going to move it somewhere else. That's
right?
it. We'll replace it with something else.
For sure. It's
so the real question becomes, how are we using our time?
Right. And to your point about remembering time, so often, we discussed this when we were talking about all the stuff that we have, we bring items forward with us, especially when you were talking about your move, that reminds us of these times that we had that were. So I do want to mention before we are almost out of time, that this dusty clock, and like I shared, I was going to dust it. I figured the dust, even though you may not be able to see it at home, is an indication of the time that I've had it. Was gifted to Brian and I on our wedding day. And you can see how much time has passed, but August 2nd, 2003. And the clock is not even, I don't know if you've been seeing this at home, it's not even working. I need to change the battery. It's just something that sits there. But as a marker of that moment in time and where we were, and of course when I look at it, I'm not looking for the correct time, obviously, Maria, but just reflecting on how far we've come. And how much has happened during that time.
So the symbolism and the meaning that's attached to the item. So as we think about time and its impact on happiness, I guess the lesson for today is as much as money gets associated with happiness in both positive and negative ways, there's another resource that should equally deserve our attention, and that is the resource of time and how we're spending our time.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us today. Thank you.